I walked in there expecting to write a book about curriculum and instruction. The real story that revealed itself to me in my year in reporting was it was really about school culture.
Welcome to another episode of School 2.0, conversations about education and everything else. On today's episode, we'll talk about something that always seems to be controversial, which is the issue of charter schools. For those who don't know, in brief, charter schools are not quite public schools, but they're not quite private schools. They're publicly funded, and they're technically part of the public school system, but they're privately managed and run, which means that they have the ability to do certain things, innovate in certain ways, try out certain ideas that conventional public schools can't. And critics worry that all they do is they take the most motivated and dedicated students and give them a very different sort of education, which undermines democracy. Defenders believe that they're kind of hotbeds of innovation that give students choice in a system that generally doesn't provide students choice. Today's guest is Robert Pondiscio, who is a public school teacher in the South Bronx who decided for a year to embed himself in and observe the happenings at one of the most successful charter school networks in New York City called Success Academy. Success Academy is a network of 40-some schools in New York City that gets consistently good results, but what's even more interesting is that it serves almost exclusively impoverished Black and brown students. So Robert, just like many people, want to figure out what is going on. Is it like their critics say that they're just taking the best and the brightest, so the results aren't terribly surprising? Or is it that they're doing something at Success Academy that's completely different from what the general public schools do? Well, Robert found a pretty complicated mix, and we're going to talk about what he found in his year at Success Academy. We have a wide-ranging conversation about everything from what it is like to teach at Success Academy, to what it's like to be a student or a family there, to the importance of school culture and how Success Academy really is able to leverage that. So let me briefly introduce Robert. Robert spent 20 years in journalism, including senior positions at Time and Business Week, and he decided after that career to become a fifth grade teacher at a struggling South Bronx public school in 2002, where he taught for 5 years. Currently, he's a senior fellow and vice president for external affairs at the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, and he also continues to teach civics at Democracy Prep Public Schools, which is a network of high-performing charters based in Harlem, New York. So I really hope you enjoy this discussion, whether you're just curious about charters or Success Academy or what charters mean for democracy and public education. Robert Pondiscio, how are you?
I'm well. Thanks for having me today.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm excited to talk about it. You have a book out that I'm really fascinated to get into. It's called How the Other Half Learns, and you spent a year in a charter school. It's a Success Academy school. So why don't we start off with a brief sketch of your book and how you came to write it?
Sure. And we should also just mention, because we always assume that people know this and they probably don't, or we shouldn't take for granted that they do, what's charter school?
Yeah.
I'm speaking today from New York City, which is one of the charter school meccas in America. There's quite a lot of them here. But for the relatively uninitiated, a charter school, there have been about 30 years have been charter schools in America. And what they are, I guess the easiest way to say it, is schools that are publicly funded but privately run. One of the misconceptions people have is that charter schools are private schools. They're not. They are managed by private organizations or individuals, but they are publicly funded schools. So in other words, anybody can attend. You apply, and if there's not enough room for all applicants, then you have a lottery. So it's first come, first served. But they are not private schools. They're not like a Catholic school or a private or boarding school, for example. But the brief background for how I came to write this book. I had a other life a long time ago now in the media world. I worked in the magazine industry and radio news for many years. And right around the time I turned 40, in what I now describe as a midlife impulse purchase, I signed up to teach for 2 years in the South Bronx under the aegis of a program called the New York City Teaching Fellows, which is kind of like Teach for America. You sign up for 2 years and they train you, and then you go off and teach in a high-need school. I ended up teaching, for reasons I won't bore you with, in the South Bronx. Signed up for 2 years, stayed for 5. And my original assumption was this was going to be my midlife public service stint, and then I'd go on and get back to my career. This became unwittingly almost a second career, and I just became fascinated by urban education, by issues of curriculum and instruction and literacy, I frankly I don't think I knew what a charter school was back then. And I didn't know what one was until one opened up on the 5th floor of the building where I was teaching. And I had to, move my classroom. But once you have exposed yourself, I think, to the realities of schooling for disadvantaged kids in this country, it's very, very hard to go back to what you were doing and look away, so to speak. So there was no such thing as a Success Academy. There were barely any charter schools in the South Bronx when I was teaching. This is circa 2002, 2003. After that, this network of charter schools founded by a woman named Eva Moskowitz started. And they have been not just successful, but wildly successful.
You mentioned in the book that if Success Academy, which I believe has 20 some schools,
45.
If they were their own school district, you mentioned they would be not only the most successful in New York City, they would be the most successful in New York State, which is really interesting.
By a considerable margin. Yeah, by a considerable margin.
Because they serve primarily and overwhelmingly low-income students of color.
Absolutely right. At least 4 out of 5 last time I looked at the data were low-income kids of color. As they have grown here in New York, they are now serving more affluent neighborhoods, but that's still basically who they are. But the proposition is kind of simple and fascinating to me. How is it that this school or these schools were succeeding where I and so many others had failed? Because what's fascinating to me about Success Academy, and I now do education policy work for an outfit called the Thomas B. Fordham Institute in Washington. This seems to be a proof point for what ed reform has tried to accomplish in the last 20 or 30 years, which is get not just some kids of color, low income kids at or above proficiency, but large numbers of them, and not just succeeding against the standard test metrics, but wildly successful against those metrics. I mean, virtually every kid reads on grade level or above. The vast majority of kids are not just achieving in math, but are getting the highest possible scores in math. So if you do this work, it's impossible to not look at a Success Academy and wonder, as I put it in a 2014 essay in the New York Daily News, what the hell is going on here? And how what do we learn from it? And is it replicable? Because the last point that's worth understanding about Success Academy, which is also fascinating, it's not as if they have a couple of schools that are good. Literally all their schools are good. So of those 45 schools, of the ones that have testing grades, there's not a bad one. I don't have the data in front of me, but just from memory, something like 85% of the kids are passing their state test in the very worst one of their schools. Something like 90% of the kids are passing in math in the very worst one. These are numbers that most neighborhood schools in New York City they would win a Nobel Prize if they were able to deliver these results. And this is happening across Success Academy's entire network. I mean, even among our most legendary charter management organizations, the KIPS, the Uncommon Schools, the Achievement First, you're always going to find an outlier or two. There's literally no such thing as an outlier so far for Success Academy. They seem to have figured something out.
So let's go back then a little bit to the idea of charter schools, because I think that discussion will play into kind of discussion of Success Academy, why they get the results they do, and that, which is the subject of your book. It's kind of like what's going on here, I think. So unlike regular public schools, although we mentioned that charter schools are technically public, if you go to public school district's website, you'll see the charter schools listed as public schools. They receive public money, but unlike regular public schools, they don't take just all the kids in a particular district, right? You have to select in some way into a charter school.
You don't get randomly assigned to a charter school, right, if that's what you mean. I mean, you have to raise your hand and say, no, I want that. That's the starting line.
And that's actually one of the trade-offs that charter schools make. My students often ask me, well, why would a charter school choose to be public if they're privately run? And they obviously get access to tax funding. But one of the concessions they make is we take everyone who applies, as you said, until we have more applicants than seats. And then, unlike a regular private school, which can then select who you take, you have to do some sort of equitable lottery,
Correct.
Which means you can't just take the best students.
Correct.
Right. So that's one of the trade-offs. I wonder, though, I know you say in the book that one of the criticisms that Success Academy and other charter schools go through is the suspicion that they're just taking the best kids and therefore they get the best results. Because in order to go to a charter school, you have to apply, which automatically means your family is doing something that other families aren't doing.
That's right.
How much does that seem to affect
That's a
the
great
results?
question. In fact, I could even say that is the central question of the book. The moment one mother says, okay, well, that's, I don't want my kid to go to that neighborhood school for whatever reason. I want my kid to go to a charter school. Well, she has automatically differentiated herself from the parent who just says, no, okay, what school are you assigned to? Okay, that's where you're going to go. And then you can take it to another level. Once that same mother, again, same race, same income, same everything, but a mother who says, no, I've heard about these schools called Success Academy or KIPP or Democracy Prep where I teach. What's that all about? Well, that's a different level of engagement. And we have pretended, I would argue, for years that those differences don't matter. And I think they matter quite a lot. So it's just, I just don't buy into, frankly, the ed reform orthodoxy that says that once all I need to know is that this is a charter school and they get a good outcome with the same demographically matched set of parents. I think it's a lot more complicated than that.
Right. I mean, the other difference, of course, is that traditional public schools are, quote unquote, publicly run. They're run right by the executive branch of the government. Charter schools are privately run. This is, again, where it gets tricky for my students to understand because it is tricky. It's a publicly funded school, but the government gives that school public funding in return for its ability to be privately managed, which generally, I think is usually justified by saying, we're going to give you a little bit of latitude to do things the way you want to do it so that we can give families other options.
Well, I think also you have to go back to the history of the charter school movement back in the late 80s, early 90s, I guess, where I think, and people like to point this out, and it's a wonderful story that, Albert Shanker, the head of the American Federation of Teachers, was an early proponent of charter schools. And of course, now we think of unions.
That was in the 80s, right?
Yeah, against charter schools. But, the reason is because in their original conception, charters were perceived as, well, there was a general acknowledgement, that look, a lot of, American students are just not very well served by traditional education. We need some platform for more, to encourage experimentation and innovation. So I think it was Shanker's phrase that charter schools would be, quote, engines of innovation.
Yeah.
So that's why there was a lot more, interest in them across the aisle, so to speak, not just politically, but folks that we now perceive as anti-charter were more on board, 30 years ago. So that was the real promise of charter schools, is that they would be, again, these laboratories of innovation, and they would come up with new models of education that could be pollinated across the broader K-12 world.
So what sorts of things then, when you embedded yourself in Success Academy, one of their schools for a year? Actually, it was more than one school because you followed Eva Moskowitz around to different schools.
Yeah, I visited a number of schools, but I spent most of my time, and this is almost novelistic, that in a school that was literally across the street from where I was a student teacher 20 years ago, and in the same school district where I was a fifth grade teacher for 5 years.
So let's talk about some of the stuff that you saw there then. Being a privately managed school, my understanding is that charters have a bit more latitude. They can do certain things in terms of policies, how they run things that are different from a conventional public school. So what are some of the things that you saw that Success Academy can do that a conventional public school couldn't get away with?
Yeah, boy, that we could talk for days about that because it's a very long list. But I mean, I think that the key thing, or a key thing to understand first is how similar they are from one school to the next. So yes, I spent most of my time in one Success Academy, but I visited, easily, 15, maybe 20 others over the course of my reporting. And they all have, the same look, the same feel, the same pedagogy, the same curriculum, the same uniforms. I don't want to give the impression that it's mixed school, that would be dismissive. It's not. but they have routinized to a extraordinary degree a certain coherent look and feel and set of practices that are very predictable and scalable across their network. So where I, for example, as a public school teacher in the Department of Education, was encouraged to kind of, make it my own and make curricular decisions that would engage my kids. That's just not the way it works at Success Academy. There's a model. There is one model. And it's the same model in the Bronx, in Harlem's, in Carroll Gardens, Brooklyn, at Hell's Kitchen, Manhattan, etc. It's the same throughout their network. So that's right there.
And that's actually super fascinating itself because, first of all, that shatters potentially another myth about school choice is proponents always say, schools of choice are always super diverse and, they're getting away from standardization. But yeah, as I was reading your book, it struck me that you make it a point to mention that they are very standardized, at least within the Success Academy network. So just like when I go to Burger King, I know what I'm getting. That's why I go to Burger King. When I go to Success Academy or choose into that school, in some sense, I know what I'm getting because it's the same basic system as the other Success Academies.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And as a result, they attract a certain kind of parent. We should talk a little bit about just the kind of the process, the application process, because one of the criticisms of Success Academy has been over the years that they are, quote, creaming students. In other words, that they're selecting the highest aptitude students. That's not what they're doing. It's more complicated than that. We can talk about it later. But yeah, it is absolutely impossible, I would argue, to accidentally find yourself in a Success Academy. You're walking with both eyes open. They are quite clear, as I like to say, about what they stand for and what they will not stand for. Yeah. So you are absolutely either buying into or willing to accept a very set school culture, pedagogy, curriculum, set of conditions. And they are not willing to change that for you, me, or anybody.
So this another interesting part is that in the book, you make it a point to say, most of us believe that a public school district has a certain in common curriculum and that if Success Academy is doing the same thing, they have an in common curriculum. That's not unusual. And you're saying it's really different. Like Success Academy is much more standardized in terms of their curriculum.
Reason, this is why I should start to enumerate reasons why I'm a bad education wonk or a bad policy wonk. Because, most everybody in the education policy world focuses on the externalities of education, testing, data, teacher quality, chartering, accountability, etc. My shtick is to say, okay, look, those things are great, but can we talk about what the kids do all day? In other words, I'm kind of a fetishist for curriculum and instruction. And it's because I was a public school teacher for so many years. So I listened to conversations by policymakers where after a while you say, wait a minute, are you under the impression that everything that happens inside of a school is pretty much the same? Where'd you get that idea? Let me, pull up a chair. Let me tell you what this is really like. And look, there's been a lot of work by Rand and others that show the degree to which teachers, sorry to wonk out on you on curriculum and instruction here, but the overwhelming number of teachers, literally 98% of American elementary school teachers, from memory, rely on, quote, materials that I found or created myself one or more times a week. So in other words, if you have this idea that, my kid's school is different and there's a set curriculum, there's a 98% chance that you're wrong about that.
Yeah, I can attest to that on a few different levels. As a former teacher, I know that was the case with us. We had suggested lessons. Our district had this was back when we had CDs. We had a CD of suggested lessons for stuff, and we had a set of standards. But yeah, a set of standards is different from a actual curriculum. Here's what you're going to teach, and here's basically how you're going to teach it. Yeah,
and the other thing is, I always use is that standards are not blueprints; they're building codes in a sense.
Right.
They'll tell you what how to build something to code, but they don't tell you what to build. That's exactly right.
Yeah, and then as a professor at a college education, I can attest that a lot of our time is spent teaching students how to write lesson plans and how to refine their lesson planning skills. And I guess I was reminded from your book, because Success Academy doesn't quite do it that way. Teachers aren't
Not
both
even
writing the
close.
lesson
We don't
plans
do it that way at all.
Yeah, and it's a really bizarre multitask to be expected to both deliver instruction and write lesson plans, because it seems like two very different skills. I don't know if you felt that way as a teacher, but it seems like there's...
This is confirmation bias on my part, but I think this is what, at the end, kind of struck me the most about Success Academy, was for years I've been railing against exactly that phenomenon that you described. And as is my wont, I make rueful jokes about it, like saying that, like, if we hired contractors for our homes the way we train teachers, we would not, your contractor would not start the day at the lumber yard buying materials. They would start the day in the woods with a chainsaw, because, well, Mr. Contractor, you're the best person to know which kind of tree would make the best cabinet. It's just kind of crazy that we expect teachers to be both expert curriculum designers and deliverers, because, to your very good point, those are just not the same skills at all. And by contrast, we don't say, for example, well, look, Yo-Yo Ma, he's a great musician, but it's not like he wrote the Brandenburg concertos.
Right.
We don't hold any other profession up to that standard. Okay, Gielgud, you're a great actor, but you didn't write Hamlet. So why do we expect teachers to be, both expert curriculum designers and deliverers? Each one of those jobs is an incredibly heavy lift. If you expect people to be expert at both, you are quite literally pushing the job past the cognitive bandwidth of not just the average teacher, but the most spectacular teacher. They're just not the same tasks.
Yeah, at very least, you're asking them to divide their attention so that half of their energy goes to one and half to the other.
That's exactly right.
So as a Success Academy teacher then, how prescribed are this curriculum? When I go in as a teacher to do the job there and they hand me the curriculum, what level of detail am I going to see?
That's a great question, because one of the criticisms that you hear from people about the approach that you and I are discussing is, well, teachers shouldn't be robots reading scripted lessons. Well, they're not scripted lessons. I would describe them as prescriptive lessons. There are scripted lessons out there. Direct instruction, for example, has lessons. Teacher says this. That's not what this is. But I think what's important to understand, it really is about the bandwidth issue that you surfaced before. If I know what lesson I'm teaching tomorrow, then my lesson preparation is very, very different. Instead of spending 20, 30 hours a week on Google, on Pinterest, on Teachers Pay Teachers, looking for lessons, I'm now sitting down with the lesson plan and I'm looking for questioning opportunities. I now have time to study student work. I now have time to anticipate misconceptions and plan for them. So it really is about how you're spending that cognitive bandwidth. And this is not the question you're asking, but I'll bring it up anyway. There aren't that many lessons to be learned, I think, from Success Academy that can be applied to K-12 education at large. But this is one of them. Because what's remarkable about what they do is that for years we've fussed over teacher quality in this country and trying to lure the best and the brightest into our classrooms. Here I'm going to be my unorthodox opinion number 3 for this conversation. I've always thought, well, that's a bad idea, because any profession that you need 3.7 million people to do well, there aren't 3.7 million saints and superstars out there. This has to be a job that men and women of average competence and average sentience can do well. Now, Success Academy, I'm not suggesting that their teachers are just ordinary and average. There's some spectacularly good teachers, but they do tend to be successful with men and women who come out of the same colleges that everybody else gets them from. There's a passage, I think, in the book that I point this out. Like 20 years ago, if you walk down the halls of a KIPP school, then and now you would see classrooms named after the schools where the teachers were from. So you'd see Harvard, Yale, Stanford, Michigan, et cetera, Tufts. If you walk down the halls of a Success Academy, you see Hunter College, SUNY Oneonta, which is where I went. There was a kindergarten classroom at the school that I was embedded in called BMCC, which stands for Borough of Manhattan Community College. So however they're getting these results, it's not that old TFA model of get the best and the brightest. They are getting great results with, Hunter College, I think, is the top producer of teachers in New York City. Most of them are going into regular DOE schools. Well, they're getting a lot better results with the Hunter College graduates they appear to be in Success Academy. So why is that? Because the job doable by those people.
Yeah, if I'm listening to all this, it's, there's kind of a conflicting reaction, especially as a former teacher. On one hand, it's great because just like a restaurant can't always rely on having a superstar chef who has all the spice, requirements in his head for each recipe, they can go with whatever chefs are available. On the other hand, as a teacher, it's like, that's awfully standardized, and it feels in some ways robotic. So I remember, as a teacher, I felt very conflicted because I didn't want to write lesson plans all the time. But I also remember being really averse to being told to teach a particular lesson a certain way, because it felt like when I was able to write the lesson, I was able to create the lesson that I wanted to teach. So I wonder...
I suppose, there should be room for both. And I'm so far out of the business of telling other people how they should run their classrooms or run their schools. But, if there's a case to be made, look, is this, why are we doing this? Is this for you, or is it for those 30 kids in front of you?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Know that it's, that those we should be thinking about those 30 kids and not whether you and me like our jobs more. Well, then there's your answer right there. And this is why I'm a choice guy at the end of the day, because if you don't want to teach under those conditions, well, you shouldn't have to.
Yeah,
teach somewhere else. That lets you go your own way. But don't pretend it's good for kids.
So, and let's go into some of the other things that you notice about Success Academy that they can do that other schools can't. One of them that I recall is that they can create, in some sense, contracts with families that, in some sense, demand certain parental involvements that obviously public schools can't get away with generally.
Yeah, I think that's right. And look, this really is the spoiler alert. This is kind of the whole the hoo-ha of the entire book. You and I were speaking a few minutes before we started recording. But, I think I said this in the book. I walked in there expecting to write a book about curriculum and instruction because that's what I write about. That's my, quote, area of expertise. And I assumed that I would walk into Success Academy and see first-rate teaching and first-rate curriculum. And that's why they were able to get all these, incredible and incredibly consistent results that we were discussing earlier. Well, that's not what I found. What I found, and I'm not suggesting that the curriculum and instruction is not good. It's quite good. Maybe not the decisions I would make, but that's fine. The real story that revealed itself to me in my year in reporting was it was really about school culture more than anything else. And that's complicated because that's a really difficult thing to do, even in a choice environment, for the reasons that we alluded to before, Kevin. We were talking about lottery admissions. In other words, this suggests that you are teaching the first, say, 100 kids who walk in the door. You get what you get. Some kids who like your culture, some kids who don't, some families who are down with the program, some who are not. Well, that's not really what's happening. And this gets convoluted, but I'll try to summarize it as quickly as possible. The appearance of a lottery gives you the impression that it's a random assortment. And Success has a lottery that is wildly oversubscribed. The rough numbers are about 6 applicants for every 1 seat. But the lottery is the first step in the admissions process. So you have a lottery in April. They're looking to fill about say 3,000 seats. That gets 18,000 applicants. Half of them are just told, sorry, no room at the inn. The other half, you're either admitted right away or you're on the waiting list, which they call, not insignificantly, the likely list. Then you're invited to a welcome meeting. And at that welcome meeting, they leave no doubt about what their values are, what their culture is, what the expectations are for parents, and those expectations are profound. You're expected to read to your kid every night. You're expected to check homework. You're expected to drill math facts and sight words. You sign a parental contract agreeing to, all of the ways that they do business, the uniforms, the hours. Wednesday is a half a day. They are quite emphatic about their school culture in terms of, look, we suspend kids for minor infractions. And the one welcome meeting I described in the book, the teacher who was running it, the principal who was running it, said, "This is not Burger King. You don't get to have it your way." And she was not joking. She meant it earnestly. And this is not, that's not the end of the process. Then, some number of parents fall away. They say, well, look, this is not for me. And they decide not to go. Then there's a uniform fitting. Then there's a dress rehearsal day. The undeniable fact is that at every step along this process, some number of parents fall away. And the other part of this, perhaps equally controversial, whether by design or happenstance, all of these hurdles that parents have to jump through between the lottery and the first day of school are de facto screens for parental competence. If you don't have the organizational skills and the parental bandwidth to show up and show up and show up again, well, then you literally don't make it to the end of the process. You fall away and your seat is given to somebody else. So, this is an observation, Kevin. This isn't data. The data doesn't exist. But it's quite obvious through watching this process that what comes out the other end is a critical mass, not every parent, but a critical mass of parents who are absolutely on board with this idea of or this flavor of schooling. And are not just willing participants, but capable participants. So as I say in the book, and this is perhaps a bit of an overstatement, the idea is not that if the conventional wisdom is that Success Academy is creaming students, that's not right. They're creaming families. They're creaming parents. They are appealing to a significant subset of urban parents who view these schools as, and I would argue rightly so, as having their act together. They're safe, they're well run, they're ambitious for their kids, and they are hungry for that kind of schooling. And so they embrace it enthusiastically. They do all that is asked of them. Does it work out for every parent? Absolutely not. Some find it to be, too demanding, too hectoring, but seen through another set of lenses, and leave or fall away. But as a result, you end up with a critical mass of parents who are buying what they're selling, and are willing to be and eager to be active participants in their children's education. And I think that explains in no small measure how they get these spectacular and spectacularly consistent results.
Yeah, it seems almost like the selection process and that whole process is a very little bit of random sandwiched between several non-random events. So you first have to apply, which is non-random. Then you have the lottery, which is random. Then you have all the other meetings and hoops, which are not random.
Right.
So yeah, I think focusing on the random part seems to be focusing on a small bit of it.
Let me finish this thought too, because I guarantee you that people listening to this are harumphing and saying, well, that's not fair. This is unequitable. Well, so is moving to Jericho, Long Island. The other best performing. So is moving to Scarsdale, where the de facto screen is not your ability to show up; it's your ability to afford a $2 million home. To me, the moral question of this book is if you think what Success Academy is doing is unfair, well, why is it only unfair when somebody figures out a way to give low-income Black and brown families the same advantage that affluent white families have when they pick up and move to Westchester or Long Island?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned early in the book a story that kind of illustrates that point. I forget the student's name, but you had mentioned a very well-performing student in your fifth grade class, I think it was. And all of your attention as a teacher is really devoted towards getting the students who are struggling to struggle a bit less. Meanwhile, a student who's doing really well is kind of overlooked because I think you had mentioned that the administrator said, well, she's not your problem. The other kids are your problem. She'll be fine. And it seems like you in some ways undertook this book and this journey to figure out, well, what happens to her? She's not necessarily going to be fine if we just leave her sitting in class because no one feels like she's a problem to be solved.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And that was kind of a hammer through glass moment in my own evolution as a teacher and person in education. And just to fill in the details of that story, I mean, I taught in, it's worth mentioning, I taught in the South Bronx, which here in New York City is there's 30 odd school districts within the New York City Department of Education. District 7, the South Bronx, is now and has been for decades the lowest performing district in the city. PS 277, where I taught fifth grade, was the lowest performing school in District 7. So I was literally teaching in the worst of the worst, so to speak. But that is not to suggest that it was a completely broken down system. There were kids like this young lady, Tiffany, in my class who were deeply invested in their education, who, I now see in retrospect, she was kind of the Success Academy kid from Central Casting years before there was a Success Academy. But she was exactly that kid. Had there been charter schools and Success Academies back then, Tiffany would have been, and her mom would have been the first in line, because that's exactly what they wanted from their schooling. Because she was, on grade level in math and reading in a school where none of her peers, or very few, were on grade level, and she was, unusually dutiful and diligent. That's why my special ed supervisor, when I brought up to her one day, said, "Look, I'm not doing anything for this girl Tiffany." She said, verbatim quote, "Well, she's not your problem." What she meant by that, perhaps not in any ill intention, was, why are you worried about this kid? She's where you need her to be. You've got all these kids who are below grade level, who are behavior problems. You should be focusing on them. But if you think about that's a way of, in a sense, placing an artificial ceiling on that young lady's achievement. Nobody says that to my kid. Nobody says that to your kid.
So in some sense, the message I'm getting in some ways is a plague on both your houses. The folks who just want to kind of eliminate charter schools because there's engines of inequality, you're saying, well, that's not very equal either, though, because you're condemning kids like Tiffany, like others, to an education where they could probably get a better education elsewhere. But on the other hand, those who say charter schools are great because they're engines of equality, saying, well, not so fast either. They're not quite engines of equality either. They just give people other options, which isn't necessarily equality, but it's maybe better than the monopolistic alternative.
Yeah, I think that's right. And look, I don't have the self-confidence to suggest which is the right answer. But I do think we need to be clear-eyed and not, what I described before as those kind of dueling narratives are kind of, facile and not very satisfying. The, walk in this door, bad outcome, walk in that door, good outcome. It's a lot more complicated than that. But because we have advocates, and the conversation is driven usually by advocates for one flavor of schooling or the other, we tend to create these gauzy narratives that if we just invest more in public schools, then we can do this for every kid. Or if we just give, free and unfettered choice to every kid, everybody will get a good outcome. And I think that's a nuance-averse, way of looking at it. And look, I am absolutely an unapologetic choice and charter guy, but that's not the same thing as their magic. So I think we kind of, owe it to ourselves to be clear-eyed and serious and sober about how we talk about this. But I guess the moral question that this implies is, which is better for America, so to speak? Is it better to have a system that tries to treat that buys into the idea that we give everybody the same and that will create the same outcome? Or does it make more sense long term to allow those with the level of engagement and ambition to rise to the level that their talents would take them? Because I guess the inequity in my mind is nobody puts a speed limit on my child, because if my kid is in a bad school, well, then I have the ability to either pay tuition privately or to move to the burbs, and I can get her into a better setting for her, so she has more opportunities to rise. Tiffany's mom, it was the public school or nothing. Like she did, there were no charter schools. She didn't have the income to choose a Catholic school or to move. Interestingly enough, to complete the story, the real life coda to this is her mom actually did end up having. She moved to Scranton, Pennsylvania after middle school, and I'm still in touch with this young lady to this day. She's she did fine. She graduated from a perfectly decent state university. Took her a little while, but she graduated, and she's now working for an online marketing company in Pennsylvania somewhere. So maybe my special ed supervisor was right, that she would be fine. But what I can't help be troubled by even 20 years later is, well, what if she had gone to my daughter's school? What if there had been a Success Academy? Would she have gone to, a perfectly fine state university, or would she have gone to Harvard or Yale or Tufts or Stanford? Not that those are the be all and end all, but what's better for America? Is it to just get as many kids through any college as possible, or that they can make it to and through, or is it better if you have young talent to nurture that talent and help it become all it can be? That's a more of a moral question than an educational question, but I think it's one we're uncomfortable asking.
Yeah, I mean, when I started reading your book, which is a really fascinating and very well told account, it's almost novel like in how you tell the story. I started with a question of what can we learn from Success Academy that generalizes over to public schools? If public school administrators, teachers read this book, what could they take away from it? And at least as I read the book, it's fairly pessimistic in that regard, because you kind of come away with the conclusion that a lot of the things Success Academy can do, it can do only because it's a school of choice. You can't mandate that random kids be put in this environment and random families and have Success Academy still be able to do a lot of the things they're doing, like those parent contracts, like the idea that kids are supposed to track the teachers' goings on at all times. Otherwise, there's potential punishments, things like that. Am I being too pessimistic in that read?
No, I think, a little overly broad. In other words, and this is where I think I upset some fans of Success Academy, because I think their belief is that, look, this is something that would scale to every school, and if every school were a Success Academy, then every kid would get a good result. And I just don't know that that's true, because I do think that the parental buy-in and the school culture is a significant contributor, and I don't know that you can or frankly would want to impose that on anybody other than those who raise their hand and say, no, that's what I want. But look, this is not to say that there are no aspects of it that would translate. We already discussed what I think is probably the primary one. And full disclosure, this is confirmation bias on my part, because I'd written about this long before I'd ever set foot in the Success Academy. But if you routinize, I mean, that's the wrong word. If you narrow the focus of the teacher's job to being a pure pedagogue, to being an instructional deliverer and diagnostician, as opposed to being that and a curriculum designer, then I think that is something that every school in the country can do, and I think should. I've written about this for years, that we have made this job, as I like to say, too hard for mere mortals. So if the job is about lesson delivery, if the job is about spending time studying student work, developing relationships with students, if you free up that 10, 20, 30 hours a week that the average American teacher spends on Google or Pinterest looking for lesson plans, that I think could create a watershed change in American education. So it's on the one hand, you could say, well, is that the only one? But Lord, that's a hell of a good one right there.
Yeah. Yeah. What about teacher satisfaction? Did you get any sense of general teacher satisfaction there? Do they feel overworked? Do they feel I think better compared to their peers?
The proof is in the retention rate, which frankly is abysmal. I think I said this in the book. I just don't think I could be a Success Academy teacher. It's not because I don't think that they're excellent. I think they are. And it's not because I wouldn't want my kid to go to one of their schools. I would. I'm 57 years old. I just can't work that hard anymore. In other words, they take almost without exception very young people who have been mostly untainted by other forms of teaching, and they train them extremely well, and they work them extremely hard, and as a result, their turnover rate is extraordinary. As high as apparently 60% in some of their schools. But it's fascinating, Kevin, right? Because one of the orthodoxies in education is we need to retain teachers, and that teachers don't even get good until they've been in the classroom for several years. So on the one hand, that may be true. On the other hand, if we're keeping score by standardized tests, then clearly Success has cracked the code on how to achieve those results a army, and I use that word purposefully, an army of young teachers who do this job for a couple of years and then muster out. Now, this is another limiting factor. In other words, it's not that hard to get a fresh crop of several hundred new teachers every year when you're in New York City, which is an attractive destination for young people. I don't know that you're going to get boxcar numbers of young people to sign up to teach for 2 years in, say, Utica or Youngstown, Ohio, or Topeka.
Rural Arkansas.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. So I think you have to be realistic about that. But the fact that they have created a model that seems to allow young people, young teachers, to get not just to competence, but to excellence fairly quickly, that's another thing that's worth sitting up and paying attention to.
Yeah, I mean, another reason I don't think I'd be able to make it at Success Academy is when I was reading your book, and there were some scenes where Eva Moskowitz shows up to schools, sometimes announced, sometimes unannounced, and observes different classrooms. And I think I would be terrified in that situation. Goosebumps. I got goosebumps. Were there any things at Success Academy that you saw that made you uncomfortable, or that you really didn't like in terms of the approach, thought might be going a bit far?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I have a complicated relationship with standardized testing. I've said this for years. On the one hand, nobody should sentimentalize the days before standardized tests when we could just, disregard achievement gaps. And we wouldn't even know what an achievement gap was if it weren't for standardized testing. We'd just be, we would make blithe assumptions about what kids knew and didn't know. So, on the one hand, I value the data from standardized tests. On the other hand, I refuse to be kind of indifferent to the kind of the deleterious effects that standardized testing have had on American classrooms. I mean, if you think it hasn't materially affected what kids learn all day and narrowed the curriculum to just reading and math and not much else, well, then I think you're being willfully naive about that. So I don't love that. I bring this up because, Success Academy may say, well, look, we really don't stress the test that much. Yeah, they really do. On the other hand, that's an external condition that we tend to impose upon all schools by your test scores, how we know them. So I have a tough time judging them for that. But having said that, I'm not crazy about their literacy curriculum, for example. I'm an unapologetic E.D. Hirsch core knowledge guy, and they're much more balanced literacy. Although their literature, their ELA is content rich. Long story short is, there are aspects of what they do that I don't necessarily care for. But I mean, it's what is the phrase? The whole is more than the sum of its parts. I even described this in the book. At one point, I'm watching them like just drill the kids endlessly on to get them ready for standardized tests, and I found myself thinking, why doesn't this bother me? Because this is the kind of stuff that I generally don't like. But this gets back to that culture question. In other words, the thing that is unmistakable and that you can't understand, let alone value, until you spend day after day in some of their schools, is that, look, there's a profound investment on the part of these teachers and their administrators into these children. And that's something you just don't see everywhere. In other words, and I go on at length about this in the book, if you look at American education at large through the eyes of a low-income family of color, or a low-income kid of color, there's absolutely no reason to expect that you're going to have a relationship with a place called school that is anything other than coercive and even hostile. In other words, school is where you go to learn how little is expected of you, how narrow your horizons are. So even though they may fetishize the test results, it's in the service, I would argue, of something larger. So, they go into their test prep season and nobody's telling the kids, oh, this is easy. It's quite the opposite. They're telling them, look, this is very hard. But we're going to prepare you with attack strategies and practice tests and encouragement and calls home nightly from your teacher, etc. And then what happens? The test comes, and not only do you do well, you do exceptionally well. So do all your friends. Your parents are in on it. Your teachers are in on it. And suddenly you are part of the school culture where achievement is not just aspired to; it's achieved. And you probably go home if you're a 10-year-old thinking, hey, I'm good at school, And that's something new under the sun. Yeah, it's hard, but you're good at it, and it's valorized. So I think that there's that sum, the phrase I used before, which I always get wrong. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. They create and normalize student achievement in a way that I simply have not seen other schools do.